All right, welcome everyone to a new episode of Raza Chats. I'm Mady Mantha, and today we're going to be chatting with Karen, Developer Marketing Manager at Raza, about enterprise conversational AI teams. Karen, welcome to Raza Chats.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. By the way, Happy New Year. How was your holiday break?
Thanks. It was great, pretty low key, as like probably everyone else's was.
Yeah.
But it was still good time off, time to reset. And 2021 is, off to a good start so far.
Yeah, for sure. I guess for our audience, could you tell us, I know everything that you do at Raza, and I'm a big fan, obviously, but yeah, tell us a little bit about what, you do at Raza and what's your role like?
Cool. Yeah. So I sit on the marketing team at Raza, but my background is in developer relations. So at Raza, I'm really focused on kind of telling the story of developers and teams that are building cool things with Raza. And there's also kind of a developer education kind of component to what we do. So Mady, you and I have collaborated on things like the Raza certification workshop. So there in the blog are just kind of a few places that you'll find me.
Yeah. And Raza for beginners, I think we just celebrated our 4,000 user sign up or something like that. So lots of people taking the course, and yeah, you contributed a lot to that. So
cool. Yeah, definitely. Man, was that all over the last year?
Over the last year, we did a lot. And we also had our second company offsite, second remote offsite, I should say.
Yes.
The first one that I had been to was when I had just joined Raza, was in January of 2020, last year.
That's right. We were in, seems like forever ago.
Yeah, it does. And we had this dope castle
It's great.
with 20 of us at Raza. And since then we've tripled, I think.
Or at least doubled. Yeah, it's a lot of new faces. Yeah, that was wild at the virtual offsite that we just had. There were so many new people who've just joined in the last 6 months, which was exciting. If we can't all be together in a castle in Berlin, at least we can all be together on Zoom.
No, it was definitely interesting and quite fun. And I liked, the tools that we've been using to sort of mimic in-person, spontaneous conversation or socializing, if you will. So that was kind of fun for sure.
Yeah, it's like a whole new world of virtual networking tools.
Yeah.
I know GatherTown was what we used during the offsite, but we also have some cool stuff lined up for the Raza Summit. I know there's going to be a lot of technology happening behind the scenes for that event that's going to make it, at least kind of try to replicate that feeling that you get of being at a conference and, just sort of bumping into people in line for coffee and having a chat. So
yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of my favorite parts of a conference for sure. It's just to network and talk to folks and just definitely talk to some of the interesting speakers after their talks too, which is always fun.
For sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you've done some pretty interesting things since we've been back, since the remote website and everything. I know that you've researched, talked to some of our customers and written about conversational AI teams in enterprises, and specifically the processes that they put in place, right, to operationalize conversational AI, from team setup to choosing the right platform to maybe scoping and everything else that's included in bringing a conversational AI project to life and to production. So, talk to us about that a little bit, and then we can dive into the specifics of how different or similar, these projects are to typical software applications.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so one of the most recent things that I've been working on is kind of this project management template for building AI assistants. Because to your point, I think one of the biggest questions that conversational teams have when they're kind of just getting started, or maybe transitioning from doing more mobile app development or enterprise application development to doing conversational AI, is how similar and how different is it, and what's transferable and what do I really need to think differently about? So I worked really closely with Sam Gardner. She's one of our, she leads our customer success management team. Ben, who's one of our customer success engineers, and they work really, really closely with our customers, at large companies across different industries. And we kind of put together sort of a template that lots of conversational AI teams can use to sort of like track their development, make sure that they're sort of like hitting all of those key milestones and really like setting their project up to be successful long-term and stay on schedule.
No, that's cool. So, I mean, I guess what's similar to typical software application implementation life cycles and delivery, and what sort of?
I would say that one of the things that's probably the most similar will be your integration needs and kind of like setting up your deployment workflow. Just because you're building a machine learning application doesn't mean that everything, that you learned about like software testing and QA and, having kind of like an automated, repeatable, reliable deployment process should go out the window. It looks a little bit different with a machine learning application. Because, in addition to sort of just like testing the programmatic parts of what you're doing, you're also testing your machine learning model, right? So like that's kind of another indicator of whether or not those changes are like ready to go out to production. So thinking about setting those things up, I think is very similar no matter what kind of application you're building. Where things start to get a little bit different is when you're really thinking about building an application where conversation is the interface, and how different that looks. It's going to like both affect your design and kind of some of the skill sets that you need in your design team. And it's also going to affect sort of like your ongoing project maintenance. Like how are you sourcing your training data to make sure that you're pulling in conversations that are actually happening with your users, so that you wind up with this really like representative data set that's going to give you the best performing model.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So in terms of setting up a team, what's a typical team look like, do you think? I know that it probably depends on the use case and, the size of the company, I guess. But, if you had to talk to us about what's the absolute like bare minimum that you need to get going.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, definitely you're going to have at least one back-end engineer. And you're going to need at least one person. So I kind of to broaden it a little bit, at least like one sort of like user expert, like somebody who's familiar with the business requirements of what you're trying to do. That person could have like sort of different job titles, like on a very kind of bare minimum team. Probably you're going to have sort of people wearing a lot of hats. So these might be like more differentiated roles on a larger team. But sort of like a product owner, like somebody who's designing conversations and making sure that the design of the assistant is like really meeting the user need. And then I would actually say that on a bare minimum team, you're still going to need a DevOps engineer. So that may or may not be somebody who's like dedicated to your team, but you're at least going to need somebody who's like paying attention to like the specific needs of your deployment, especially like if you're in a larger company.
Right. So, I mean, it's still super important to set up the DevOps like lifecycle, to write and run tests on an automated basis and all of that to make sure that your application is, running smoothly once you start making changes.
Definitely. I would say that's a corner that you don't want to cut, like no matter how lean your team is.
Yeah.
And I know people are always kind of looking for like sort of a formula for like, okay, how do I set up my conversational AI team? And once you start to kind of like go beyond that minimal team, it's really going to be so influenced by what the goals of your project are. Just kind of anecdotally talking to one of our engineers at Raza, who used to be on a conversation team for a media company. So it's a company where it's like very experience driven, like just super core to the brand of like having this like user oriented, like media rich experience. And so their team looked pretty different than a typical conversational AI team. You had a lot more conversation designers, more kind of like dedicated copywriters who are really focused on like the look and feel and tone of the bot, as opposed to just, back-end engineers like focusing on sort of like hooking everything up to all of your internal integrations.
Right. So, I mean, it's definitely different when it comes to like internal versus customer facing use cases.
Totally, totally. And even, customer use case to customer use case,
Yeah.
Depending on your brand identity and just kind of like your needs of like what you want to communicate through your bot, could influence like how you decide to make up your team.
I know Progressive Insurance, I think their brand ambassador is Flow, right? The Progressive person. They created a bot version of Flow. And so they had to really work on making sure the personality was just right, because it was all about, the progressive lady, right? And
Totally.
her versus maybe an internal facing help desk chatbot. Not to say that tone and personality don't matter, but then, you don't have to work as hard on developing a personality, I guess. Is that?
Exactly. Yeah. In that case, you might have somebody sort of like writing dialogue for the assistant who's, really like more of a product owner, or, like where copywriting is like not really their sole, like, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Going back to data collection when it comes to internal versus customer facing use cases, what does it look like to get maybe, a seed knowledge, or, the first set of conversations or the first set of data? And then how different, or I guess similar, is it to continue to collect data for those conversations? Because obviously, you talk about and you write about making sure that those conversations are real user conversations, or at least modeled after real user scenarios, so that your bot can successfully handle them. So what does that look like in your opinion?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think it's a question that we hear a lot, is like, how do you get your initial set of training data when you're like standing up your like kind of prototype, like first version of your bot? Because we talk about real user conversations like being the best source of your training data. But like, what do you do if you don't have any of those yet? Super common problem, and like a super common starting point for a lot of people. In our project management template, we actually use the term cold start for that phase of development, which I think I didn't coin this term, but I really like it. Because it's basically describing, you're starting, but you don't really have any of that like rich, real training data yet. So what we recommend people do is, start by handwriting like a very small data set. Try to figure out which intents you're going to need to just kind of fill out a few of those like very basic conversation flows to get you started. And people hear like handwrite training data. You really don't need a ton. Like, you're actually probably not doing yourself a huge favor if you sort of like sit down and, handwrite a lot of training data. Exactly. Because you just want sort of like a seed data set, like enough so that you can get a functional bot that you can start sharing with a small group of test users. And you can recruit those test users from inside your company. It might be at first like other people on your team who like didn't really necessarily have a hand in writing that initial training data set, so they don't know like what examples were used to train the model. Because what you want to do is capture those test conversations and really start to convert those into your next round of training data. Gotcha. It's not going to be as representative as, if you were having conversations with your actual end users. But those test users are still going to say things to your bot that you didn't anticipate or didn't write down when you were writing your handwritten data set.
Right. So. And then once you have, additional conversations from your test users, you take that, you add it back to the assistant. Obviously, you run your tests, and then I guess you could be a little more confident of sending it off to production, knowing that, it can still fail, but it's not going to fail as badly as it might have if you had just given it, your own engineered.
Totally.
Data.
At this point, your data set is a little bit bigger than you started out with. It's a little bit better. And you just sort of like go through that process iteratively again and again, sharing it with more test users. And then once you've built up your data set to a certain point, then you're ready to start sharing your assistant with your actual end users. And usually what we see conversational teams do is, you've got this bot, it's still kind of in early stages. It's not yet like as good as it's going to be. So typically what we see people do is to share that assistant with a small percentage of their users. So start rolling it out to like maybe 1% of your users, take those conversations from the 1%, add it back into your data set, and then just sort of gradually expand your user base over time.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, what you've described sounds like both, this project that you're undertaking. So let's talk a little bit about, I guess, the tech stack you would need to do something like this. Obviously, there's lots of platforms out there that folks can take advantage of, whether it's homegrown or something out of the box. So yeah, I mean, talk to us a little bit about, in your opinion, what kind of tech stack would you need? And would that depend on use cases and goals, among other things?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it depends too on sort of like the background and expertise of your conversational AI team. So, sometimes we see teams who, before sort of starting to experiment with Raza, they had a lot of really, really experienced data scientists on their team. And so kind of the first way that they approached this problem of a conversational AI framework was to sort of like build one themselves using lower level machine learning libraries. So that can be kind of a common approach that we see when people are really experienced. Then, that can be sort of difficult to maintain. Like you have the ability to customize and build it exactly the way that you want, but then you're also sort of like responsible for building and maintaining that kind of complicated tech stack. And then sort of the other end of that spectrum is choosing a tool that's sort of like maybe built more for business users. You definitely wouldn't need like a data scientist or machine learning background to use these tools to build an assistant. It's something that's going to be a lot more like drag and drop. And, in a short period of time, you have kind of a basic assistant. And then that sort of like presents its own set of challenges as well, because you wind up with something that you can't really customize. You really kind of like reach the limits of that technology pretty quickly as well. So something like Raza would be sort of in the middle, where it's like one level of abstraction higher than those like lower level machine learning libraries. You have something where like out of the box, you don't necessarily need to like understand all of like the moving parts and intricacies of like TensorFlow and kind of what's happening under the hood, but you do have the flexibility to customize it as a developer, and it's not going to hold you back in terms of customization abilities.
Okay, so you could still, dive into the, various models that we have, architecture or like dialogue policies if you want, but you don't necessarily have to.
Yeah, definitely. It's kind of deciding what level of complexity like you want to take on as a developer when you're choosing your tools, because there is kind of like a spectrum of trade-off, right? Like the more complexity you take on as a developer, the more control you have over your technology stack, kind of like vice versa. So it's finding that happy medium, like something that gives you the flexibility without having to take on like all of the complexity.
A friend of mine actually once, wrote, she's at Google, that, if you're trying to bake bread, you don't necessarily have to like build the oven and know exactly how the oven works and the circuits and whatever. You just kind of have to use it to be able to bake your bread or whatever. And it's sort of, you don't necessarily have to build a platform and your use case. You can just use a platform that's out there to create a bot, that meets your business goals.
Oh yeah. So, classic example is like companies that, intentionally or not kind of like wind up building their own CMS or something. Like, just because you can do it doesn't necessarily mean that you want to kind of like reinvent the wheel there. And yeah.
Also, like, based on your priorities, what do you want to prioritize, or what do you want to optimize for? Is, building, meeting the goal of automating conversations or reducing cart abandonment rate, or is it to like build, a next class platform?
Right.
But if I'm a a product owner at an enterprise, what do I have to know in order to like pick a conversational AI platform? Because, obviously there are like out of the box chatbots out there too that make sense for certain business use cases, right? Whether it's contact center or what have you. But what am I, if I'm not a developer and I don't know exactly how any of this works, like what am I trying to optimize for?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing to make sure that you're not optimizing for too much is, or I guess one thing to optimize for, to phrase it another way, would be like long-term scalability. So a lot of companies will start with one use case. Like a lot of times it'll be an internal use case, like an HR assistant. It's pretty common. It's something that your employees can interact with to, put in vacation requests and do different things like that. There are a lot of like kind of pre-built solutions to do things like that. But you sort of, with a really vertical provider, like an HR assistant kind of out of the box, you really run the risk that when you want to expand your conversational AI program to more use cases, you've sort of like locked yourself into this technology stack that's really only good for one thing. Right. So all of the knowledge, all of the technology that you've built up to build that first project, it's not necessarily going to apply when you decide that you want to go after a customer facing use case next. So that's kind of like, like where a platform approach comes in, is you're choosing something that's going to scale to multiple use cases, and you can sort of like reuse all of that knowledge that you've already gained by building previous assistants.
Right. And also maybe some of the seed knowledge too. Like I'm just thinking out loud here, if you're trying to build an HR assistant, and you already have built like, an IT help desk assistant, maybe there's like, overlap in knowledge bases as well that you could probably transfer over.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also probably overlapping training data to some extent. You've already built up some intents that sort of cover like conversational use cases. Scaling the same platform like allows you to reuse a lot more stuff like that.
True. And I guess what are some of the risks though, if you, in addition to what you talked about, do you see like a risk with all of this knowledge being or creating these silos where business units end up using different platforms and they don't really have the ability to talk to each other because they've essentially just created these silos? Yeah,
definitely. You see that a lot, especially at larger companies with, lots of different kind of business units across them. You'll see a situation happen where the different business units are essentially using completely different conversational AI stacks to do basically the same thing. So you lose that opportunity to do knowledge sharing across different business units and really reuse like what you've already invested into building assistants.
No, that's a good point. And in your recent article, you talk about how chatbots or conversational AI, it's not necessarily a project, but we like to look at that as like a product that we're trying to build. Can you, tell me a little bit about what you mean by that and how that is, a product versus a project?
Yeah, definitely. So what we mean when we say product versus project is sort of how you look at your definition of done. Like when you're talking about a project, you're talking about something that has a very defined beginning and a very defined end. But when we talk about a product, I mean, like in the sense that Raza is a product, or, like any technology company that like builds software is a product. You have more of this idea of like an agile approach where you solve a problem by first building like a minimum viable product or a prototype, bringing in user feedback as soon as possible, incorporating that feedback, into your development process, and then just kind of iterating over and over again. Like, I don't know that we would ever say that like Raza as a software product is like done. There are always going to be more features, like more enhancements that we want to add. So companies can kind of apply that same sort of thinking to building assistants. where, once you've launched that assistant to production, it's being used by end users.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily want to, not think about it anymore. You don't want to necessarily like consider it done and not put any more development attention into it. I think especially with machine learning applications, you have that whole concept of like model decay. You put a model out into the world, and even if you just kind of never touch it again, like over time, you're going to see the performance get a little bit worse, because the real world is kind of constantly changing, and you have to pay attention to making sure that your model is like adapting to those changes and getting better. So definitely when we talk about operationalizing machine learning, we're talking about really an ongoing process of, evaluating your model performance, of, labeling new training data based on like real world interactions that model is having with end users. So yeah, it's definitely iterative. Like there's not really like a set end date where you're like, all right, our assistant is done.
Right. And then you can always keep adding scope to it too. It might start off as an IT help desk assistant, but it can, grow into, handling HR capabilities, and it can grow into maybe an internally facing digital assistant overall. And the same thing, like customer use cases too. It might start off with just helping out with like order checkout maybe, but then it can start to answer questions about different products, and then it can start to do more. So do you sort of see that as that's why it's kind of a product, because you can keep adding scope to it and not, in addition to like making continuous iterative improvements?
Yeah, definitely. It's not just a matter of like improving model performance. It's definitely also like how can your assistant add more and more value to your users? And that might be by, like adding different skills to your assistant, by expanding to a different use case. So yeah, that's definitely something that we see a lot as well. I think probably one of the biggest trends that we see with Raza users is starting with kind of more of a chatbot, like text-based use case, and then over time expanding to voice, because that's, in huge demand. And it's also a way, when you expand to voice and you're kind of reaching customers through your call center, for example, you're greatly expanding the value that you're bringing to those customers. One of the customers that we work with, NIB, they're an Australian and New Zealand insurance company, kind of took the same approach where they started with like a text-based assistant that was embedded in their website. And then over time, they now have like an IVR assistant that's doing some call routing and helping with different tasks in their call center.
Oh, that's really interesting. So I guess you could use the same platform, right, to build something pretty quickly. You don't have to do a whole lot of development to get started. You can fail fast and try out things that may work, may not work. And then once you have a minimum viable assistant or product, you could then, collect more data and then try to do take a data-driven approach where you add features that maybe your customers ask for, or you add things in the way that your customers say it, and then, graduate that to maybe a voice-based, contextual assistant.
Yeah, that's really the key when you're talking about platform choice. Like to go back to your topic from earlier, if you're using the same platform for a text-based use case and a voice-based use case, you're able to use kind of like the same backend for both of those and reuse a lot of the work that you already put into it, building out that text-based chatbot. Although there are kind of some interesting differences when you start looking at like training data for voice versus training data for text. But even still, like you want something that's going to be able to sort of like, reuse that same backend and be a lot more efficient when you expand.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. What else do you want us to know about the project template that you created for conversational AI teams?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of my favorite things about it is that there's a downloadable template that you can just make a copy of and use it for your own projects. It's pretty detailed. It's really closely based on, like what we use one-on-one with our customers. So it has been, kind of road tested with some real projects, and, we've seen success with it. We can share the link for that in the description.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I did know that because, I do work with you and I have read that piece.
Thank you.
Kind of weird, like I have to, ask you these questions, but, I did know the answers to that. So that's really cool. I am hyped about that because I've never seen a project template for conversational AI projects before, it's just something you see for typical projects. So I'm very hyped about that. I haven't used it yet, but I'll take a look at it now.
Yeah, if you do, let me know what you think. And same to any listeners, we would love your feedback on the template. If you find it useful, if there's anything that you would like to see, let us know.
Yeah. Can they do that on the forum or where?
On the forum, or I would actually say another really good spot for that kind of discussion is our LinkedIn group about conversation-driven development.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe we can share that link as well too, but it kind of includes folks from inside Raza and then just kind of a lot of industry folks from across conversational AI who are building assistants and really kind of, thinking through kind of like a user-centered development process. So yeah, start a thread there. We'd love to engage you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Thank you for that. I totally forgot about our CDD group on LinkedIn. It has yeah, folks. Yeah, I mean, and you don't have to, have feedback for us. You could just like join the group to check out the conversations that people are having, right? About what it's like to maintain these large scale enterprise wide bots in production and what it takes. It's a really fun place to hang out for sure.
Yeah, definitely lots of production stories, I'd say.
Yeah. And I know that some of them are actually going to talk at the Raza Summit in addition to folks from Gartner and other places too.
Yeah, definitely. If you haven't gotten your ticket yet for the Raza Developer Summit 2021, we have some special deals going on right now. So you can go to raza.com/summit. I believe we still have team pricing up. So if you bring 4 or more people to the summit, you can get a discount. But yeah, we've got, 3 days of talks lined up, 2 days of workshops. So if you're interested in, project managing AI assistants or working on conversational AI teams, especially at bigger companies, you won't want to miss it.
Yeah, for sure. And Karen is also going to be doing a workshop for the summit, a day before the summit. So yeah, feel free to catch that as well. I know that's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And actually, Mady, you will be at that workshop as well, along with a few folks from the Raza product team. We're really, it's going to be a new workshop, so we're really excited about it. It's going to be really geared toward not so much a developer audience, but for product people and conversation designers, who are kind of part of this ecosystem of roles that build assistants and sort of modern companies. And what they need to know about working with Raza and about, sort of incorporating user-based design into building assistants.
Yeah. I mean, you summarized that perfectly. I'm really looking forward to the workshop because like you said, folks from the product team are also going to be joining us, including you. It's going to be a really sort of cross-functional team that put together this workshop that's going to teach it. And we hope to have, a diverse audience as well that can, learn with us and offer some really cool insights.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome.
All right. Yeah. Sounds good. So we'll definitely link to some of the resources that you mentioned, Karen, to the, the free project plan that folks can download and also information about the summit and so forth. Thank you so much for your time and for coming on the podcast to chat. I definitely really enjoyed it. And yeah, our audience, stay tuned for the Raza Shoutout segment. All right. Thanks. Welcome to Raza Shoutouts. I'd just like to take a few minutes here to acknowledge our amazing community for continuing to do interesting things with Raza. So thanks to Mohammed Zerga for creating a TigerGraph DB connector for Raza. And they also published a tutorial and a video demo, so check it out on our forum. Shout out to Raza hero Cobus Grayling for releasing 7 chatbot design considerations for the African context. And Cobus does a really good job explaining why it's going to be applicable in most countries where users' first language is vernacular. Shout out to Raza hero Ashish Sani for putting together a playlist of Raza 2.0 tutorials. So be sure to check him out on Ashish's YouTube channel, and we'll connect to that here in the description. Shout out to Hokum Ben Mahfoud for sharing their Raza chatbot, which controls Raspberry Pi via the Android app. So watch that on YouTube. All right, that's it for this week's episode. Join us again in a couple of weeks on Raza Chats.